Hi. As people, let me show my face too here. Hi, as people are coming in and joining our webinar this afternoon, I have a couple of questions if you're comfortable to share. It can help me to tailor some of my comments and in particular the examples, depending on what your roles are and the ages of the students you're thinking about, because this is a pretty broad topic. And like I said, I'll try to be meaningful for the people who are here if they want to share what they're looking for. Otherwise, I will proceed accordingly. So again, as people are joining, if you could share in the Q&A box, if you're interested, what your roles are, what kind of the ages of the students you're thinking about. And if there are any questions that you're thinking of right now, I'm throughout the presentation, I'm encouraging people to share, to post questions within the Q&A box, and I will do my best to answer them as we're going through. And I'll probably repeat this, but if there are some questions that I can't answer, I'll do my best to note those and get back to you all. Hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks so much. Just as people are coming in, asking for them to share some information about what are their roles, if there are ages of students that they're thinking of and considering, and if there's anything pressing that comes to mind. Understanding I'll do my best to answer questions as we're going through. We got a start time of 12 o'clock.
And I see Dr. Rossini is one of the guests, so welcome to Dr. Rossini. Good to have you.
All right, we're gonna give about one more minute. Get to the very end of that 12 o'clock. And as it's noted here, this is being recorded. So, and the PowerPoint will be posted as well on our website. So if there are things you miss, you're welcome to go back and look at the recording and reach out for questions. I love to talk about students, particularly about students and their learning. Okay. Okay, great. All right. All right. So I'm going to get started here. And again, as if people are thinking of questions as we're going through, please go ahead and put it in the chat box. Pardon me, here I am navigating technology here. All right. So we're talking about dyslexia. I'm Elizabeth Hooper. My background is, well, I'll get to that in a second here, but I work with Matt Cohen and Associates, and today is February 21st. So I do have my role with Matt Cohen and Associates is as an advocate. I do have decades of teaching experience across, boy, a whole lot of settings. As it started off as a general education teacher, so that gave me a really nice foundation in what is the developmental sequence of what we expect neurotypical progress to look like. And then I was able to teach in a variety of roles, mostly as a special ed teacher in inclusion programs. I was a private advocate for many years, including over 7 years now with Matt Cohen and Associates. I gotta say, it is a real thrill to get to work with such a great team, and we're all able to pull from our different areas of expertise and really, think creatively and ambitiously about how to meet different students' needs, different parents' needs, and work effectively with different school staff. I also get to do private executive functioning coaching. I don't know if you can see there's bizarre hieroglyphs behind with these are different mnemonics that I have my students, that are helpful. And I figure while they're staring at me, might as well learn, when you're annotating characterization, plot, and theme, and when you're taking a test, you can curse, right? Cross off, underline, restate, skip any equations. So if you're looking for, if we're looking for executive functioning strategies, there's some behind me. Now we're talking as well. I want to be very frank as we're going into this presentation. I am not a reading specialist. Excuse me, getting over a cold here. I'm someone who has taught reading to a number of students in a variety of settings, but mostly I'm going to talk with you about how to advocate or how to navigate the system and effectively advocate. All right. Okay, so here's just an overview of the things where I'm hoping to tackle today. Pardon me. A fast version of dyslexia. We've got more information on our website. Talking about how dyslexia is diagnosed typically, from clinician. What are the tests we're looking at? What do we do if the school is saying kid's fine, but it sure appears that the student is struggling? Talking through some appropriate interventions. What do you want to consider when you're looking at those interventions? And then how do you advocate for those appropriate interventions? And again, if you have any questions or comments or what have you, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. I'll do my best to answer them during our webinar. And if I don't know the information, I'll do my best to find it out and get back to y'all. All right. So, fast version of dyslexia is a language-based learning difference that affects a person's ability to connect letters to sounds, which affects reading and spelling. For this presentation, I'm focusing on the reading component, the decoding, and not the encoding. But there is an absolutely reciprocal interaction between the ability to sound out words and the ability to spell the words. In fact, actually, typically I see that students decoding, so receptively, how they're able to discern words, usually comes along faster than that encoding, because encoding is just fresh, right? You have to come up with the whole thing the whole cloth out of your brain. And typically, again, the students who have dyslexia have normal or are oftentimes above average intelligence. And here's just a citation for where I got that definition from if you want to read some more about it. But if you want to know more about the science behind dyslexia, I highly recommend you go to our webinar. This talks about the science behind reading disorders. We had a speech and language pathologist, also a specialist in reading, who talked in great detail, and I think was just extremely, I learned a lot in terms of what is the profile and why is a student learning like this? What is a student's profile and what do you do with that information? And then, pardon me here. So, general considerations for when we're looking at a diagnosis. Vision and hearing is a big deal. Okay, so when schools do screeners, and sometimes those screeners catch things, and sometimes they're not subtle enough. Like some students have mild hearing loss at certain decibels that won't be captured through just a screener. But schools are obligated to really look at and understand and unearth what are the hearing and vision needs of a student. Now, my personal experience, districts have vision itinerants, hearing itinerants, but they tend to be pretty big picture, gross, not in terms of like disgusting, but it's in big picture, and really only tuned into students who have significant, substantial chronic needs. So kind of a subtle vision or hearing challenge may not be addressed through the hearing or vision itinerant, may not be addressed effectively. But it's going to affect the student. And the thing about hearing and vision that I'm constantly struck by is the student doesn't know that their experience, how they're hearing, how they're seeing the world is different than anybody else's oftentimes. So it isn't until you're really kind of digging in, you go, oh, wow, you really can't hear. That's why it makes sense. You're mumbling these words. You're having a hard time discriminating these sounds because you're not hearing them. So it's gonna be very hard to work on phonology, which I'll get into a little bit more, if you literally can't hear the sounds. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to really make sure the kid can hear you and can see what the text is saying. Also, you want to look at if ruling out RO is ruling out, if mental health could be a factor. Because, I can think of in particular high anxiety can have enormous effects on demonstrated skills. I'm thinking of a student who in middle school really struggling with reading, learning, and like a lot of concerns about, do they have a reading disorder, right? Well, come to find out, they were incredibly anxious. And when that anxiety was addressed through therapy and medication, lo and behold, that student who literally months before we were thinking had a significant learning disability didn't. In fact, actually, they were average to above average in reading, but it was because of mental health that it clouded the validity of those scores. So we really want to be looking very comprehensively. So again, that goes to this next point that no single test can diagnose dyslexia and no single test can rule it out. I often see schools use what's the F&P, Fontes and Pinnell evaluation, which is the beginning books are very scripted, right? We're using similar sentence frames over time. So there's a lot of memorization. They're pretty heavy in terms of using visual cues like pictures. So many students who are bright, knowledgeable, have background information can effectively guess their way through an F&P. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to multitask this in reading the Q&A and continuing to talk. Okay. Okay. Oh, pardon me. So again, I see some teams come back and say, well, they scored average on the F&P, so they don't have dyslexia. That is not an appropriate nor valid evaluation of dyslexia. So as a firm, we recommend, where possible, seeking a neuropsychological evaluation. Typically, this is done by a psychologist who has an area of expertise. Many insurance providers will cover this, and we also have a number of providers that we know do really effective evaluations that have clear findings, and from those clear findings give a really clear roadmap to the school. Schools are obliged to consider outside of evaluations, and so the more clear and concrete and explicit those recommendations can be, the easier it is for you to advocate that those recommendations be implemented. All right. So a little more specifics about how the areas that we look at, what those areas are, and tests or methods that I typically see to use to assess that. So rapid, I'm just going to forewarn you, special education loves letters to stand for things. So I'm trying to include within there the full name as well as the shorthand that people don't usually call it the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing Second Edition. They say the CTOP. So I want you to be knowledgeable and you can use the jargon and follow conversations. I can diagnose. Okay. Huh. That's really interesting. About there's a question about speech pathologists' ability to diagnose dyslexia. I think it depends on their background, right? So as I was sharing, the person who had done our webinar with us to talk about the science of reading, it's that first part of that webinar that they're really talking about the science of reading. They have a background as a speech pathologist as well as a reading specialist. So I think you need that combination because you need to, it's not just language, it's also how language and text interact. And it's real complex. And again, as we were talking about before, there are a number of factors that can give invalid findings that you really want somebody who understands the nuance of reading to be doing that assessment, I would attest. And again, Matt, I'm not sure if you're with us, if you have any other comments about that, if a speech and language pathologist should diagnose dyslexia.
Well, I think that part of the underlying point that you're making, but I might underscore, I think that typically a neuropsychologist or a psychologist is important to get IQ testing as well as the various tests that are appropriate in relation to reading. However, and many of you have encountered, many school districts these days rely on MTSS RTI, which stands for multi-tiered systems of support and response to intervention, in lieu of psychological testing. And the reason that they do that is that the Congress moved away from what's called the discrepancy formula, which looks at the variability between the IQ scores and the achievement scores to assess whether a child has a learning disability in reading or otherwise. And the reason I bring that up is that I think that a speech pathologist would have a lot to contribute, but particularly given the RTI MTSS emphasis anyway, I'd want to have as strong ammunition as possible clinically to counteract or to overcome the MTSS RTI. And Beth was referring to Fontes and Pinnell. They take a little snippet of information and they say, oh, the child's within age expectancy on the Fontes and Pinnell, therefore they don't have a disability, when in fact there are a variety of other problems they're having in reading that aren't captured by that data. So I'd say this SLP is complementary, but probably not adequate by itself.
And there's a question here that I'll touch on, and I'll try to get into a little bit further too. We're talking about that the family does have a concise and effective neuropsych evaluation, but the school wants to do their own testing. Well, again, Matt, if you've got I've heard you say many times, unless there's some, real cogent reason to not allow the school to evaluate, it can be difficult to advocate effectively when the school is saying you are not allowing us to collect the information that we need. So in general, we advise you to, if there's some substantial reason, like it's going to be highly anxiety provoking for the student, they've already had all these tests, there's no more that you can do. In general, we advise that you kind of go along with the process, but try to steer that process. So talking about, again, be very clear about what the other evaluator did, because oftentimes there's a protocol. You can only administer a test within like a certain retest within like 6 months. So coordinating with the outside of evaluator, and sometimes then the school will say, oh, whatever, you already did it. But sometimes they are looking for their own data. And that's where, again, having somebody to, have really concrete and solid recommendations is helpful, as well as schools pretty commonly say, well, we don't see that at school, right? And we don't see that here. So having the evaluator observe can be helpful to say, respectfully, I did observe what we're seeing here, right? And it might look subtle, but again, that's a way to kind of anticipate and counter sometimes where the district is going. Matt, do you want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, Angela asked a couple of relevant follow-up questions to that. And I would say, Angela, first, we recommend a neuropsychologist, but in fact, the core testing could be done by a clinical psychologist privately or a school psychologist. So there's nothing legally that says that only a neuropsychologist is capable of doing the basic testing that would allow for diagnosis. We appreciate the more sophisticated testing that neuropsychologists do, so that's still useful. But the school district is not obligated to accept, as Beth said, the findings of the private evaluator, and they will try to cherry pick what parts of both the private evaluator's data and the school data support that the child's making adequate progress. And unfortunately, we have lots of cases where that's what the fight is about. And ultimately, the more data points that you have, both from the private evaluator and from the school data, and from things like the report card and parent providing video of what happens when the child tries to read when they're at home, or anecdotal reports of the difficulty the child has reading, all of that becomes data that has to be weighed to ultimately come up with a conclusion everyone can agree to, or they get into a legal fight about it.
And I'm going to talk in depth about a number of ways to show that a student is having challenges, and then advocate that something different needs to be done about those challenges. So going back to just the components that we look at for identifying dyslexia, we look at that speed. How quickly can you get the simple rote information like letters, right? Out of your face quickly, because that speaks to the automaticity of reading and reading fluency. So, and reading fluency is closely aligned with comprehension, which I didn't make a box for that one because that's not necessarily, it's kind of a component, right? If you can't decode, then it's a struggle to comprehend because you don't know what you're saying doesn't make sense, and you're really slow in how you're saying it. Um, but I'll talk more about that. And phonology is the sound, it's a system for the system of sounds for language. And I had a reading specialist say to me once, and it just really helped me out, that phonics is when you have text in front of you, and phonology is when there's no print, right? So that, you know, you're rhyming, you're substituting initial sounds, you don't need to have print in front of you. As you can imagine, students with working memory can have a real difficulty with this, even if they have the language abilities to do it, they can hear it, just holding on to it can be a real challenge. Word reading, and I'm so sorry, on the right-hand side are a number of tests that we typically see the schools and private evaluators using to evaluate these areas of need. So word reading is, it first starts with, again, that phonics, right? Can you match letters to sound? And then can you read both regular and irregular words? Another area that's evaluators look at is sometimes it's called pseudo decoding, sometimes it's called nonsense word decoding. This is one of my favorite areas because I find that not only does it help us get some insight into decoding, but it also tells us what a kid knows and doesn't know. Like, oh wow, it looks like you understand the R control vowels, you understand, you know, the ending syllables. So it really kind of helps it's very meaty in terms of not just what your score is, but what your skills are and how does that translate to more generalized reading. As well as, for a lot of our kids who are bright, sometimes they've just memorized words. Doesn't mean that they can decode, doesn't mean they don't have dyslexia. And again, it can kind of cloud that data. This is a nice way of cutting through. Like Jeb, J-E-B, that is not a word a student is going to normally find that they could have memorized. They'd have to produce it on the spot. As I was talking about oral reading fluency, that's how quickly a student can say the words accurately when reading. Uh, it does not assess prosody, so that means like reading with inflection and kind of demonstrating comprehension. Oftentimes we look at oral reading fluency, or ORF, because, well, for one, it's an indicator of a student's ability to keep pace with the classroom. And often it's an indicator of a student's ability to comprehend. Because if you're reading in a slow and halting manner, often it affects comprehension. So the test, the Woodcock-Johnson, the Wyatt, the KTA, they all have oral reading fluency. In addition to the GORT is a good test for that. It's a it's a different test in terms of, also just want to take a second about talk about comprehension. The GORT is a different way of assessing, in that all the other tests, the student continues to have the text in front of them while they're answering questions. In the GORT, the text is removed and they have to rely on their memory. So again, it kind of assesses slightly different skills. As well as, schools frequently do, like through Ames Web or different progress monitoring probes, like 1 minute, how much can you read over time? Those can be extremely meaningful because our students can be consistently inconsistent, right? And to really kind of track that progress over time, because sometimes, you know, you're going to get a book that it's about, you know, igloos, and the student just loves everything about igloos and really is quite knowledgeable about it. Well, again, that's kind of color the results that you're getting. But again, if you're looking at a number of data points over time, that is extremely meaningful. And a lot of times what schools should be doing, and I'll always see it happening, is they have a goal, right? Here's here's what the rate we're expecting to see of progress. And then here's the actual rate of progress. And if they're not lined up, because again, sometimes the graphs are kind of hard to read, and that's an indicator that what programming that student's getting is not working for them. We also look at vocabulary. And you know, again, Woodcock-Johnson, Wyatt, KTA, they all work. But I also want to mention that schools use a tiered system of language right now, going from the most commonly used words to very specific academic words. think it's along 3 tiers. I'll get into, as Matt was referring to RTI/MTSS, that kind of aligns with that kind of tier system. It can be extraordinarily impactful to get at, where is the student at along those tiers? Where are their holes? Having said that, though, because it's not so scripted, it takes a pretty skilled practitioner to effectively evaluate along those different tiers and really report out meaningful information. Moving on to what is the school's process for finding a student eligible under a specific learning disability for reading? Now, I'm just going to start off by saying schools typically just say specific learning disability. I've seen some schools just not want to use the language dyslexia, and I've seen some families feel very insistent that the team uses that term. Personally, I'm a pragmatic kind of a when working with schools and about children, I'm kind of big picture what needs to be done. SLD and dyslexia falls under the category of SLD. I don't know how much you really want to have a battle about what language they're using, as long as the programming, the understanding of what that looks like and how to program for it is in place. It's up to you. As Matt was saying, we used to have a discrepancy model where we're looking at this kid's intellect and where they're performing, and is there a big gap? And if there's a big gap, then that's an indicator of a specific learning disability. Schools can elect to use it. I can't think of an instance in the last 10 years that I've seen any school district elect to use it. Matt, I don't know if you've seen anybody, but usually they say, even when it's like, whoa, we're talking 99th percentile of intellect, and then the kid is reading at like the 14th percentile, right? Or maybe the 15th percentile. I say, well, they're right there in the low average range, but look at that gap. And they still say, well, low average. Matt, do you agree?
I agree. As to what schools do, I would say that we use it.
Yes.
And so in the real world, as Beth is referring to, schools try not to use it. It ends up creeping into the discussion. And if we end up in a situation where the family needs to request a due process hearing or have a due process hearing, which is very much something to avoid if at all possible, but when that's necessary, it certainly comes into play in the hearings.
And I'm going to ask, I'm so sorry, Dawn, could you repeat your question? I'm having a kind of a hard time understanding. Maybe Matt will make a little bit more sense, but I really want to make sure I'm understanding your question. Maybe you could rephrase that for me. Oops, pardon me here. So typically the route to identifying SLD is not that discrepancy model. It's the response to intervention, RTI, which is now called multi-tiered support systems, and more letters, MTSS. This is an area where we see a number of school districts take advantage. It is RTI, MTSS, is intended to be a short-term targeted intervention to clearly see if just giving a short injection of support will get a kid caught up. If you continue to give those short injections of support, or continue to give those injections of support, then we're not really assessing. There was a little gap, right? You just need a little bit extra to get caught up, because where this is coming from is before there was a real concern that students were being over-identified as having specific learning disability, when really it was like they just needed to learn the multiplication tables, right? They just needed to learn some very discrete skill. And then once they got that, they were good to go. But yeah. Pardon me. I'm so sorry, I keep doing that. And again, I'll talk some more about this later, but I would also argue too, it's going to be really hard for the team to assess if a student responded appropriately to an intervention if there isn't a clear goal of how do we expect that student to be responding. As I was talking about before, that oral reading fluency, it's built in. Here's the goal. Are you making progress? It's very concrete. And then again, there's some points I'm repeating, my apologies, special ed teachers, but I really want to hammer. You need to consider data for multiple assessments, right? And as we're kind of going to get into more of the specifics of what does that look like, I just want to highlight that the need for specialized instruction, that's what triggers an IEP, right? So if a student needs additional instruction beyond what the general education program can provide, and it needs to be from a special ed teacher, not a reading specialist, then that's the indicator of a need for an IEP. I included a document that is dense. I got no other word for it. However, I find if you're looking to kind of get into the details of what is the process, what are the directions, what is the school going to be following, this link will unopen all those secret doors there, right? That's what they're following here. Okay, so there's it's a little outside of my scope of where we're going here, but there's a question about why would you want to avoid a due process hearing? Well, in general, the law wants this, and again, Matt, if you want to jump in and correct me or chime in, please do. However, my initial response is the law wants schools and families to work things out. So the system is set up to, let's try to work it out the IEP. Let's try to work it out in mediation. Let's try to work it at lower levels. And I'm just going to say, and Matt, I'd love to hear your thoughts here, but from a practical standpoint, typically, I mean, due process, if, sometimes you need to do what you need to do, but we typically recommend that as a later step and try to resolve things in the interim as amicably as possible, because while adults are squabbling, typically the student is not getting appropriate supports. Matt, did you have anything you wanted to say about that?
Well, I would say that schools, there are problems with schools in refusing eligibility, and there are problems with schools in acknowledging eligibility, but providing a level of instruction and a curriculum or methodology for instruction that are inadequate to what the child needs. So there are a number of different ways that the conflict can play out, but what Elizabeth just said is quite accurate. We strongly support working things out wherever possible, and to some extent, there has to be a balancing act of what you can get from the school, and will it be done correctly and with fidelity and intensity, versus even is it worth it, and how much time are you going to spend fighting about it or getting it some other way. But that's just depends on the individual case.
And again, Matt, please correct me if you don't agree with me here, but in a practical sense, the people who are it's the state, right? The State Board of Education who is allocating the hearing officers, and districts are under the auspices of the state board. So we see that there's quite a bit of deference to schools, especially if parents have not tried to work things out. So again, that's just it, and it's also you want to have an attorney. It's unbelievably time consuming and typically very expensive. Whole lot of reasons to try to figure things out with this school if you can. And also mediation is it's a little bit less of a strong statement. It's a little bit more friendly. It's voluntary. The school district can say, no, I don't want to do it. And it can be a little faster. So again, while the adults are squabbling what's happening with the kid. And then there was a mention of an ISB complaint. In general, state complaints work best when there's again, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong here, when there's a very clear violation, right? Because again, it's the state looking at the districts, and the state's already kind of supervising the districts. And so it's got to be something pretty clear. Like I'm thinking of one where the family, just very concrete, right? Not open to interpretation, where the family continually told the school, we cannot make Friday afternoon meetings because of work. And the school continued to say, we're only offering Friday afternoon meetings. Well, state came in and said, no, you need to offer more times. That was really concrete. So often, yeah, state doesn't necessarily want to weigh in on the abstract. All right. So I'm going to get into more specifics here. So just again, the nitty gritty of how schools determine if a student has a specific learning disability for reading. So there's some exclusionary questions that they're going to ask at the beginning, like, is this a product of maybe is the challenge because of an English as a second language, because of absences, because of inappropriate education. But given that those exclusionary factors have been ruled out, we're looking at 3 inclusionary questions. And the thing I really want to highlight is this second, the 2 versions of yes, right? So you need to have a yes for all 3 of these questions. But there's 2 different kinds of yeses. One is yes, straight up. Let's see if I can, oh, if I touch it, it's going to move. I apologize. The first, number 2, right there. So there's 1, no, 2, yes, the student is progressing. I'm sorry, that's a typo. I'm sorry. The student's progress is significantly discrepant, just flat out, right? They're scoring at the 2nd percentile when average is 25th and above. Or number 3, yes, it's the student's, oh, that's a lot, I'm so sorry, that's a lot of typos in there, I apologize. The student, their progress is not discrepant only because of the intensity of the provided intervention. So if the student has been getting extensive RTI, we could say, okay, maybe they're not discrepant because you've been meeting with them 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, working on instruction. Again, and my apologies for those typos over there. Sorry. Huh. So there's a question on exclusionary factors when a child with dyslexia continues to be taught with balanced literacy. So what they're talking about, that question about if a child has been taught appropriately, they mean general education. They mean like really broad strokes. Did they get, you know, was there any reading instruction that was at all appropriate happening in the classroom? So it's a pretty typically, teams go pretty fast through those exclusionary criteria. And unless there's something very glaring, like the student was absent for 8 months, typically the teams don't identify as an exclusionary factor. So no, the idea of, is balanced literacy appropriate for a student with dyslexia? Does that indicate that they didn't get appropriate instruction? No, the team's not going to mark that box as no for that one. They would say, yes, they got appropriate, like the classroom was providing appropriate instruction. So again, these are the 3 questions that they're going to ask. I'm not going to go through them. You're welcome to. But other than I want to emphasize this last one, number 3, again, that's really talking about if the students, again, here's the general education curriculum. So again, that's where they would be able to mark yes in those exclusionary factors to say, yes, they got, research-based instruction, general education, right? But we're saying if you continue with those general education programming, is that going to be enough, right? Do they need something more? Do they need specialized instruction again? And that what triggers the IEP. I just want to forewarn you, and again, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong here, but they mean a special ed teacher, not a reading specialist, like a Title I teacher. That's not going to amount to getting an IEP because they're not a special ed teacher. Okay. So you want to be careful about that distinction. All right, then moving on here. So you had the IEP, or you had an eligibility, and the school is saying no. We're not going to give your kid an IEP. Or, you know what, let's do some more RTI/MTSS. Or the school is saying, you know what, my gosh, look at all the great progress the student has made. Let's exit them from an IEP. By the way, they need to do a reevaluation to exit a student from an IEP, just so you know. But that's a little outside of the scope of this webinar. The school doesn't want to change the programming, right? Like for instance, as people were saying before, the school is saying we do balanced literacy, and the student's not making expected or meaningful progress, but then the school continues to say, no, well, balanced literacy is the way we're going. These are areas of concern that we often see. Or schools don't want to program for generalizing skills. Like, you work on this, again, the 30 to 60 minutes when you're with the special ed teacher in the resource room, and that's where it sits. Doesn't go anywhere else, which, as you can imagine, is a real problem in terms of having a student make meaningful progress and making connections to how to use these tools across their day. Where are these criteria resource from? So there's a question of where am I getting this information from? This information is from the Illinois State Board of Education document. So that link here, I'll go back here. Oops, this link. Oh, no. no, excuse me. This link, excuse me here. Where did that go? I'm sorry, I'm having some troubles here. I'm going the wrong way, pardon me, that's why. This link at the bottom has where I'm pulling this from. Okay. And then, okay, how do you make the case, right? To say that school, what you're saying is not correct, right? I'm gonna answer a couple questions here. Okay. So one, again, we want to look at multiple measures of progress. We talked about before, you don't look at one tool, but we also want to look at multiple contexts for doing work, right? So maybe, for instance, in class, this teacher's saying, my gosh, they just do a great job, and they're getting, A's on everything. Well, it might be because they're working very closely with a peer, and they're getting a lot of answers from them, not really understanding the work that they're doing, or with a teacher who's not fully acknowledging how much help that they're giving. And then you go out, and then they're like, well, wait a second, when I see the student at home trying to do homework, I am not seeing them able to apply these skills. Well, again, if a student is understanding and has mastered these reading skills, they should be able to generalize them across settings. And if you're not, and if, again, and if they need extensive adult help to be able to apply them, then we're going to say that they're not really reading independently and they need something different. Gather and share targeted clinician support. I have a lot of specific information for you about that. We've been talking about that before. That's like neuropsychologists, speech and language pathologists, people who are outside of the school who can help give recommendations and findings that the school is obliged to consider. And it's kind of then up to advocacy, effective advocacy to try to impart that people actually follow those recommendations. More ways. Okay. So again, those frequent progress monitoring probes, like the oral reading fluency, like I was talking about before, can give you some really meaningful data. And again, and really kind of see how, kind of with some amount of minutia, how well is the student responding to targeted intervention? So for instance, maybe in the Wilson system, they are working on, again, those R-controlled vowels. And then you can look and see, and a practitioner can look and see, are you applying these on the oral reading fluency probes, let alone have a score we're able to track trends and see if we're meeting goals in a very concrete and not as open to interpretation way, which can be nice when you go into meetings. So it isn't where the school, as Matt was saying before, can try to minimize or cherry pick data. It's a clear graph, right? There it is. It'll be very helpful. Again, like I was talking about, RTI and MTSS exceeding the scope of what it should typically be. So Fuchs and Fuchs, this is back about 2 decades ago. They were really the couple of researchers who really spurred on the idea of let's make sure that the student doesn't just need an injection of extra help before determining that they need this huge IEP and all these user services, which can remove them from the general education environment. Here's a link to the PDF of one of their early reports. Charting skills over time can be extremely meaningful. Sometimes you look back and go, wow, hey, they really have been making some meaningful progress here. But sometimes you see, that is the same goal area they've been working on for the last 2 years, right? How many times they've been working on CVC words, consonant, vowel, consonant, very simple words, right? How often are they going to be reading at this level? So you can kind of track, and that would be an indicator of this is not meaningful progress. We need to move forward here. Formal assessments can also be a nice way to track. So again, as we were talking about those tests, the WIAT, the key TEA, all those CTOP, right? And if a student's scores are dipping, or if they were low and staying low, well, then that's an indicator that the school's programming is not effective. Also, so the point of an IEP is to get kids ready to be an adult, as well as to help them participate in general education curriculum. So comparing students' progress to Common Core standards, which is what Illinois uses and many other states use, to determine what needs to be taught and what needs to be what students need to demonstrate that they've learned at the different ages. That can be a really nice way to, again, to kind of compare. And good practice is that schools are using either goal reference at a minimum. Pardon me, standards reference goals. So they're referring to which standards, we can kind of see how close are we in that developmental track of where they should be per expectations. Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, and I'd be interested whether Dr. Rossini has a comment about this also, but and perhaps there's a subsequent slide. I don't remember if Elizabeth this is covered, but one of the things we also find is that kids score well on the MAP testing or whatever the district-wide measure is. They score adequately on the broad achievement tests like the WIAT or the KTEA. But then, and this is where the private testing becomes very important, on some of the tests that Elizabeth referenced, the CTOP, the GORT, the test of word reading efficiency, or others, those more targeted tests, that's where the learning disability shows up. And so when I talked about cherry picking earlier, you can also be strategic in looking for more in-depth testing, and you may surface a problem that hasn't shown up on the data that the school is pointing to.
I did not mention MAP testing, Matt. Thank you for that. I wanted to take a quick second here too, just to kind of talk about all of these tests. They have their subtle differences, right? And we could spend hours and hours talking about those subtle differences. I just want to highlight though, MAP testing is a unique little beast. It's untimed, right? So some students take, you can ask for that data. I encourage you to ask for that data because again, it can be very illuminating. Literally, some students take, what did they say? It was 6 hours. It took 6 hours. They got an average score, but they took 6 hours. Also, part of what MAP testing does is again, it's a unique beast in that if you get the question right, the subsequent question is more abstract, it's harder, it's more complex. If you get the answer wrong, then the next question is more simple, more concrete. So students, even who score average, right, the 25th percentile, a lot of times the only questions that they answered were very simple. And again, may have no indicator of the higher level thinking that they're able to do, just where it wasn't able to express. Going back to also, again, like we were saying, again, oral reading fluency, there are also norms for each grade, how fast a student should be reading. So, and it goes, the higher the complexity, so everything goes up, right? The complexity of the language goes up, the complexity of the decoding goes up, the amount of words on a page goes up, and how fast you're expected to read. All of those go up. And so if they're not all going up, then there's a gap and you need to address that gap. So that's what I look at oftentimes when I see oral reading fluency goals. I go and I look at the norms to see, are they expecting a student to be reading, for instance, a 5th grade passage at 5th grade expectations? Or are they expecting a student to be reading 5th grade level, but at a lower rate? And if they're reading at a lower rate, again, that's an indicator that they're not ready for that higher, more complex text, pardon me. Yes. Okay. I'm just going to read from Dr. Rossini. Thank you very much. Lots of students with dyslexia can do well on MAP reading because it is more of a measure of comprehension and vocabulary, which is a nice segue, if I may, to another way to kind of illuminate the impact of decoding and dyslexia is to compare with listening comprehension. And a neuropsychologist and school can also do these evaluations. I'm going to forewarn you, sometimes schools, and depending on the kid's age, it may or may not be appropriate, but sometimes schools will then say, well, let's just, give the student a whole bunch of assistive technology, AT, like they can listen to the text, right? And we don't need to remediate. Arguably, students, again, depending on their age, unless they're like 20 years old and they only have a couple more years left in the system, they need both. Because if you project ahead and they're, they have a job and they're, I think oftentimes if your boss hands you a note, you don't want that student to say, excuse me, I really need you to email me that note because I can't read, right? And it's going to come up in a lot of places and not to, it's outrageous what a gatekeeper reading is to be an adult. to getting into college, to getting a job, to being able to function as an adult. It's unbelievable, the implications. Again, topic for another day. I'm gonna touch on a little bit more, but transition planning. Oof, duh. Also, I suggest you highlight the mitigating effects of private support. So for instance, maybe they're doing well, but you're like, yeah, because they're spending 3 hours a week seeing a private Wilson tutor. They'd like to go outside and play. They need to get more work done during the school day so they can go out and hang out with their friends. They're too exhausted to be able to, have, and then again, form those peer relations. So we're further disabling the kid because we have to provide supports that you are not appropriately doing during the school day. Mitigating effect. Also, those clinicians can write some nice letters of support to talk about what are they working on with the kid and what should the school be doing as well. And as I was talking about that, the implications of reading, when I was a high school inclusion teacher and we were preparing students for, what were jobs in transition, I cannot tell you how much their reading level informed what job opportunities we could look at. Right? It's huge. So you want to talk about, where do I expect the student to be, 18, 19, 20, 25 as an adult, right? And then we backwards plan. For instance, they should be able to go to community college. Well, then there's a certain level of reading and writing they need to be able to do, and or using technology to be able to be effective there. So it's a really powerful part of the transition program. But the IEP is the transition part. In Illinois, you're obliged to start filling out that form, that portion of the IEP, when the student is going to be 14 and a half within the duration of the annual IEP, so 14 and a half. However, I strongly suggest you start talking about what are we getting them ready for as early as possible. I'm thinking about conversations I had with parents, their kids were in kindergarten, and they were meaningful because they aligned, what are we doing? Because we don't have all the time in the world. What are we doing with this instructional time? Pardon me here. Yeah. Okay. Yep. All right. So considering what would be appropriate interventions, I just want to start off by saying that schools have very broad discretion to determine which, and this is what they're obliged to do, peer-reviewed approach to the extent practicable. Okay. So parents do not have a right to come in and say, you guys are doing Orton Gillingham and or you're going to do Wilson, like here's a specific program you guys have to do. In general, I mean, unless you know the school is doing it, sometimes I find that that's not an approach that goes over real well with schools. Instead, it's more, what do you have? Is that going to work? If not, why not? Because there is the second piece. Schools must provide programming that's reasonably calibrated to progress that is appropriately ambitious. Thank you, Andrew F. This is a big court case that moved the bar of how are we determining if a student's making progress from just making progress to making meaningful progress, appropriately ambitious. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. The outcome of this case. What Works Clearinghouse is kind of an omnibus site that I see a lot of school districts use, we use as well, to look up the research basis for different programs. Like all websites, there, sometimes it's not the most up to date, but I do find it to be robust in terms of the information that it has, and I can't think of a program that I tried to look up that they didn't have. So it's there. Again, as we're thinking about interventions, I highly encourage you to think about the student's profile, because as we're going to get into the different programs, they cater to different students and their different profiles. So for instance, just to rattle off their attention, how interested are they in reading? Their working memory is a big one. What prior reading interventions do they have and how do they respond to them? And then their articulation, like speech, cognition, their age, vision and hearing, there it is again, right? Again, as I just said, review what worked and didn't work, and then look at the ability to generalize. Again, this is one of the things that I often struggle with schools about, is this idea of we just do it during this one little time, right? Reading reading intervention specialized, showing these skills only need to happen during this short time when we know that the kid is reading and writing across their day. And if they're not applying skills, then it's really hard to see progress. So looking at generalization, and I'd like to arm you all with some ideas too, that there's the IEP has kind of a mandate to support generalization, because IEP goals are intended to support a child's involvement and progress in general education. And if they're only doing that skill in this tiny little time of their day, how is it applying, right? Again, here's the citation. All right, so a little more nitty gritty here, right? So I'm going to read my little caveat here. These are some programs that I see local schools, and here are some of my general impressions from advocating. This is a very loose, very broad, my personal experience. So I'm just going to be real fast. And Matt, if you've got anything, let me know, please. Orton Gillingham is the program that many of the other reading programs, they model themselves after. It's so when you're doing straight up OG, it is unscripted, and it's a very robust program, but it takes a very skilled practitioner who's been doing it for a long time, because again, it's not as scripted. They need to be able to understand and read and be able to make meaningful educational decisions based on data and the scope and sequence of skills. Again, you get a good OG practitioner, it's fantastic. Wilson, slower paced. It's for second grade and up. So Foundations is the one that I see that's the precursor to it. Is really more working on the sounds and symbols, connecting sounds and symbols. I just want you to know though, that's a general education initiative, not intended for students with disabilities. So if they need it to get up to second grade, that's fine. But then after second grade, we really should be looking at robust interventions that are intended for students with specific learning disabilities. Also,
just to
yeah,
be a bit more precise with that, those are both Wilson programs.
yes.
What
Yes.
school districts often do is they offer Foundations as if it is the Wilson reading program. And parents need to be very aware that those are different programs with different age targets and purposes and effectiveness. So when you're getting Foundations, you're not getting the Wilson Reading System program.
Thank you for helping me be more specific. However, the nice thing about Wilson is that there's no age limit. Adults who don't know who can't read, Wilson is fine. It's a good program. And what works for some students, it doesn't work for others. Again, is that slow pacing. So at each stage, there's a lot of opportunities to practice. As compared to Slant, which is very similar in scope. Again, it's an OG-based program, but it goes a lot faster, as in there's not as much practice at each step. As you can imagine, some students that they want to, oh, I'm so bored, let's go. Slant might be a better fit. But Wilson might be a better fit if they really need to practice. I do want to pause it, even before I get into Take Flight. These programs all, the student is supposed to demonstrate mastery before you move on to next steps. So you shouldn't, they really need to show a pretty high score. It's usually like 85% or 90%, to be able to move on to the next steps, which is a big deal because a lot of our students, they just get scooched along, and there's big holes in their learning because nobody really drilled down and made sure you understood it and learned it and could demonstrate it. Take Flight, again, it's another OG component, but I see it also pulls in some aspects from different programs as well. There are a lot of components. There are a lot of components that are pretty speech heavy. So if you're, working on trying kind of connecting the articulation piece, really kind of rounding it out, it's a good program. But because there are a lot of components, students who have working memory and attention issues, this can be a challenging program to gain traction, learn the strategies, let alone gain traction with them. LIPS is a totally different kind of program. I'll be really honest, I'm not hugely familiar with it because I'm not Linda Mood Bell certified, but you have to be Linda Mood Bell certified. It's from them. It's a all the research and the personal experience that I've seen is that it's a very effective program, but the only downside is, besides being, because it's very expensive and not a lot of people are trained in it, it can be hard to generalize. So it can be hard for a special ed teacher, a general ed teacher to implement some of the strategies because they're not as commonplace. But again, very effective programming. And Lindenwood Bell can, and I see some school districts on occasion will take them up on this, go in and train school staff to not only do lips, but they have other programs like visualizing and verbalizing that help with reading comprehension. SRA Reading Mastery. This is an old school program. It has some efficacy to teach students who are under third grade decoding. It's a system that has like this kind of, within the fonts, they have a different font that is supposed to reflect the decoding, right? So they like have an upside down backwards E to show it's the short E sound. My experience is that a lot of students look at me like, I have taught this one, but looking at me like, why are you showing me this text? It's a little tricky again to learn those different symbols, and they don't translate to anything else. So you can only really use the very narrow band of text. It's always not so interesting. Like I said, it's an old school program that SRA Reading Mastery has. All right. Woo! Look at that time. I gotta go faster. I'm sorry. Okay, so okay, as I talked about before, ways to make a case for inadequate progress. A lot of those data points you just keep you emphasize. You really you flesh out here, right? And then here's some language for clinicians to describe reading programs so that schools are kind of, you need to use one of those interventions I just talked about to address these needs, right? It's explicit, it's multisensory, it's sequential, it's intensive, it's research-based for students who have dyslexia. It teaches those skills to mastery, right? So just having that language in there in general, and then if you can get clinicians to talk about not only does the team have to implement the program with a fidelity of minutes. All of these programs have certain, okay, if you're this size group, you should have this size minutes for this part of the day. Usually there's a range. So hopefully you get a clinician that'll not only talk about that you need to do it with fidelity, but where within that range the student should be, not just for the minutes, the size of the group. And one more time, emphasize the need for generalization to those taught skills. Also, important note, just want to point out, many clinicians mean this student needs this, right? They require this in school, but then they use a little softer language like they would benefit or meet their potential. Schools are not obliged to, meet students' potential per se, right? They are obliged to do what's needed or required. Now, if a practitioner doesn't think it's needed, then they're not going to note that. But if the clinician doesn't use that stronger language of needs, requires, it's likely that the school's not going to hear their words and their recommendation are just going to go out the window. This is where I get a lot of squishiness too, is the collateral impact of reading, right? Where students are saying, I'm embarrassed, I don't want to go to school, people are picking on me, I feel bad. And especially when the student is reporting, there's some really nice student interview templates as well as rating scales to elicit from the student what they're thinking. And in my opinion, and in my experience, I should say, how is the school going to tell straight-faced that kid, no, you're not actually feeling bad about this? It's very meaningful. It's very meaty. And there's a lot of ways to elicit student input in a meaningful way. Like, for instance, if they're not going to be forthcoming at school, maybe you talk with them privately and you scribe or you videotape or what have you to record what they're saying with authenticity. Paper trail, special education is a lot about paper. So the more you can email, correspondence, like these are the concerns and what are we doing about it? The easier it is to go back and say, I told you so, and you're not doing anything about it. And if things ratchet up and you're in mediation or due process, these are the sorts of records that we pull out to say, look at how many times the family expressed this concern. And look at the school's lack of response. Food for thought too, copy and paste an email over and over again, maybe change a couple of words, is a very effective way to be a persistent communicator and not take too much time out of your day. Find and work with internal allies within the school. I know I was one of them when I worked in the public school, where you have, practitioners who are just, I'm here for the kids, right? And they're willing to work with you and they're willing to help you understand and navigate the school system, because each school is its own little microcosm, and it's really helpful to know the players and to know how they interact with each other where possible. Again, paper trail, documentation, that's the name of the game of special education. And Matt and I are probably gonna have a little conversation about this. So Matt asserts that you should say within the goals what the name of the programming is. I had administrators tell me, no way are you ever going to put in the goals what the name of the program is, because then that's, wedding them to that program. And so I typically avoid that fight and just say, could you put it in the notes, because it's just as legally binding. But Matt, you got a different take. So that's the educator perspective on that.
Well, I'm not saying you should. It's just a strategy to try to tie them down.
Gotcha. But so we forewarn you that they're likely going to say no, but if you can get in there, good on you, right? All right, and here's some resources. So I want to emphasize that on this resource page, this is where we have the webinar of the science of reading disorders, and just oodles and oodles of resources. And this presentation and the PowerPoint will be posted there as well. ISB's got a lot of nice resource as well to understand in pretty parent friendly, not layman's terms, right? What is this parent's guide? It's really accessible, and it really walks you through a lot of components. I'm really blown away by what an effective document this is. It hasn't been updated for a little bit, but 4 years is still pretty current. And then they have some information about dyslexia. So again, it's really nice to be able to use resources that came from, so school districts or bosses is being Illinois State Board of Education. It's really nice to use resources that came from their boss that they're obliged to be listening to, as opposed to some random site that you found that's probably effective, but the school district may be less inclined to listen to. Okay. Right. Any last thoughts you want to say, Matt, before we scooch?
Thanks. Great job. And thanks to everybody for your comments and participation.
Thanks so much. And if there are any questions, oh, wait, pardon me. Here I am. Holler at me. That last number is a cell phone. You can text me if any questions come up. I'm just going to tell you, it gives me a real thrill when people think of me and think of asking me questions, because, it's nice to be needed. So again, any questions, even if you think it's kind of a silly question, please just holler at me, because, if I may selfishly, you'll make my day. Thanks so much for joining, and hope you all have a wonderful day.